So a little bit of a smaller group today. So we're going to keep going. So we have so it's keeping your kids on God's side week 3, so we're already 3 weeks in. And we're going to keep going with similar conversations what we were having last week. So it was conversations about God part 1 last week, and we're going to keep going, do part 2 this week. This week's not quite as heavy with some of the content that we were doing last week, but it's still really important stuff and different challenges that are going to come towards God from different parts of the culture. So what I like to do first is just do a quick review over, and I messed up these slides a little bit, but the first one is, what is the Kalam cosmological argument? So that's one of the things we talked about last week. Anybody remember what that one was?
Was that when you were talking about was it Jupiter being the trash can?
Close. That was you remember that one? You remember that? Yeah, that's kind of a unique image with that. Jupiter being a giant garbage can. That was the design argument, right? So that was where we can observe how there's this quality called specified complexity, where there's different constants going on all at once that only designed things have, right? And the universe actually has some of that. DNA is actually one of the best examples of that, right? Because it shows a pattern, and it's also very complex, which really only designed things have that quality, right? So that's what's called the teleological argument, that's good. You remember one of them. Cosmological argument is actually simpler than the teleological argument in many ways. It's made up of 3 premises, and we'll see if it starts to jog your memory a little bit. So the first premise is that anything that begins to exist has a cause. So the second premise then is the universe began to exist. Right? So before 1920, actually, science had this consensus that the universe was eternal. It didn't have a beginning. And then Edwin Hubble in 1920 could see that the universe was expanding, which then implied that if you go backwards with it, it comes down to a point, right? Which means that it had a beginning. And so science's consensus now is that the universe had a beginning. And that's actually something that Christianity and the scientific community agree upon, right? Is that the universe had a beginning. Now, where they disagree upon is the third premise, which is that the universe then had a cause, which we call God. Okay, so they will say it may have had a cause, but it's not God, right? And so what the argument then turns into, well, what was the cause? Was it an intelligent being? Was it an intelligent designer? Or was it something else? It has to be something that's outside of anything that's in the universe, right? It can't be mass, it can't be space, it can't be time. It has to be outside of all those qualities, because if you have any of those, you can't create yourself, right? Like Katie, you can't create Katie, right? You might be able to create another being, but you can't create you. In the same way, mass can't create itself. It has to come from something outside of itself. And so it's really kind of an illogical statement to say that matter begot matter, because that can't really happen. So there's actually some logical flaws with the scientific consensus that is not a problem for the Christian consensus. So that's the cosmological argument in a nutshell. What is one reason that God might allow for evil in the world? There's really one that we drove home last week. I don't know if you remember, or don't even try to think about last week. Can you think of a reason that God might allow for evil in the world? Yes, that is the crux of the argument that we discussed last week, is that if we can't make the decision against him, we can't really make the decision for him, right? So it's if he inhibits our freedom, then we can't really have that genuine relationship with him. So that's really the main reason that we talked about why he might allow for evil in the world.
This is the kind of stuff you guys are discussing.
This is the kind of stuff. Oh man, it got a lot heavier than that last week for us. We talked about genocide. So how is it that God, and this is part of it, how is it that a good God can send people to hell? Any thoughts on that from last week? I feel like I kind of sped through this part because I wanted to fit it, like the whole thing, into an hour last week. But can you think of anything off the top of your head as to why God might allow for that to happen?
Does it have to do with the free will?
It kind of works into it. So what is sin?
Because every sin is a sin. There's no, murder isn't different than a lie.
From God's perspective, right?
God's perspective.
Yes.
So there has to be consequences.
Right. So sin is a transgression of his law, right? And morality is something that we all intuitively understand. It was written onto our hearts, right? There's this remember this concept called general revelation? We're going to talk about it more today, so if you don't remember it from last week, it's okay. We're really going to hammer that one down today. But general revelation is that God has revealed himself to us. His moral law is in our hearts. We know when we're sinning, right? We know that if we murder someone, it's wrong. That's why it's universally across cultures. They know not to do that. It's because God has actually placed it upon us, and that's actually biblical. We know that from Romans 1:20, that we know when we're sinning. And so we're all condemned for that. So really what sin is, it's a transgression of his law, right? In order to have a law, you have to have a lawgiver. So we talked about that a little bit last week. So in this world, if we transgress laws, if we break the law, what happens? You go to jail. There's a punishment, right? There's a penalty for breaking the law. Now, if you break God's laws, what would you expect? Yeah, a punishment, right? So we can argue about what that punishment should be. Really, it's God that would determine that, right? Because he's the actual lawgiver. So it's, we can't really judge that. We're the transgressors. So yeah, and really the way that I illustrate this a little bit is what is a life sentence to an atheist? So think about what an atheist believes.
Oh, like on Earth, what's life sentence?
Right.
So if they go to jail, you mean?
Oh yeah, so like say they murder someone, and the jury decides the punishment for that is going to be life in jail, right? What does that mean to an atheist? And maybe
So that's their whole existence, and then they die, and then that's it.
It's a never-ending punishment, right? It has no end. As far the end is death, right? But from their worldview, that is in a sense eternal, right? That they will never not know jail now. And so, really, atheists aren't that opposed to eternal punishment. I think they perceive it as an injustice, right? And that's just our inability to see things from God's perspective, right? So when hell is the punishment for sin, we just don't think that sin is that bad because we identify with it. We all lie. We all don't listen to our parents. We all do these things that we shouldn't. And we transgress his laws. And because we don't take it that seriously, we think God shouldn't take it that seriously. But obviously, that doesn't make any sense. So that's just kind of a brief review from last week. And it's going to make me redo this again because I messed up the slides. Okay. So I've got Tom Hanks there. So I think we're all of an age that we remember this movie. Working with the kids, I feel like I can put that up there and they're like, I have no idea what that movie is, but since we're all adults. So does God ever judge people who have never heard of Jesus? And the reason why I have Tom Hanks there with Wilson is because he's on an island, right? And the way that this is often framed is called the man on the island argument. So if a person's on an island, they have no access to Jesus, right? There's no missionaries that can go there. They were just born on the island. How does God judge that person? Right? So that's the question. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Katie, you look very perplexed.
Yes, I would have to go with yes, but I don't know.
Right. So it's okay if you're confused on it right now because we're going to talk about it. So it suggests that God is either unfair or that belief in Jesus is not required to go to heaven. That's the suggestion when they kind of make that kind of claim. And Russ, if you want to chime in at any point, you probably know this stuff just as well as I do. Feel free to say something. And it can imply that religious pluralism is true. And religious pluralism is the idea that all religions point to the same truth. Have you ever heard of the metaphor of truth being like a mountain, and all the different religions are like paths up to the apex of the mountain, and it's all the same truth, so it's all the same way to heaven. But you can believe in Muhammad and Allah, or you can believe in Hinduism, or you can believe in Christianity. They're all the same. Has that idea ever been conveyed to you in any way? Or is that okay? It's actually in certain circles, it's a popular idea these days. But it's called religious pluralism. So it's a fancy word to say that there's multiple paths to God. That's all it is. And this idea that there might be multiple, that God doesn't judge people who've never heard of Jesus. Some of them might say, well, these people from other religions, like that maybe have never heard of Jesus, do they just go to hell? Or it kind of creates this conflict within them where they feel like that there's an injustice happening because God is judging people who are unworthy of judgment. But let's just talk about religious pluralism for a second. Do you think that could be true? Where there's multiple paths to God? Why not? Right. Right. And are those gods all saying the same thing?
No.
Right. They're saying contradictory things, actually. Right. So we have Christianity, right, which teaches that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through him. Judaism certainly doesn't accept the deity of Christ. And he's not the savior, right? Same thing with Islam, right? So there's, and you're probably a better authority on this, but like that basic premise I think holds, right? So those two religions don't hold that. So we have contradictory views that cannot be pointing to the same truth, because that is the crux of the Christian faith, right? Is that Jesus is the way to heaven. And so if we don't have that, then we don't have our religion. So they cannot be pointing to the same truth. So let's just talk about. Let's go do that.
Really more like an upside down triangle.
Yeah, that's right, and it all funnels down to Christ, right? So yeah, right. I like that. That's cool. Okay, so let's talk about these different kinds of revelation thing, right? So I was talking about general revelation, right? Which is that God has revealed himself through nature and our moral conscience, right? So we were talking about that a little bit earlier. So I just wanted to establish that again, and that comes from Romans 1, 19 through 20. So this is just the verse, just so you know it. So it's, for his invisible attributes have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, so that they are without excuse, right? So we know that we're sinning, so we're without excuse, basically. And we know that God is here because we can see it through his creation. And so we're without excuse when we try to deny that. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on there. Then we have special revelation. What God reveals by supernatural means. So what do you think that could mean? God reveals by supernatural means.
Is that like when people hear God, like individually?
So like a prophet or someone like that, right? When they're kind of, or they have the power of tongues or they speak, right? So something like that. Yes, that points to that kind of situation, right? So how do I want to put this? So the thing is that special revelation is not something that was only available to the prophets or to Jesus or to the apostles. Right? Special revelation is actually still available to us today. In what form?
Miracles?
Yeah, miracles can still happen. So yeah, so we can still see evidences of God through that. I'm not one of those people that say that miracles can't happen. The Bible, right? Because we documented all of it. But yeah, so Jesus actually was one of the great ways that God revealed himself supernaturally to us, right, through himself, right? He came in the form of Jesus, and that was pretty much the the greatest supernatural revelation that happened, which is then documented in the New Testament. But the whole Bible itself is special revelation, because there are things that we cannot possibly come to know without it being told us, right? Like, could we know that Jesus is the Savior of the world unless that was really told to us? Can we just look at nature and know that?
No.
Right, no. So someone actually, that has to be conveyed to us. And the gospel actually fits in that category too, right? So in order to be saved, you have to profess that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead. That's what Paul writes in Romans. And so that is extremely special, right? There's no way we could look at a tree and know that, right? So, and our moral conscience doesn't necessarily tell us that either. I think when we hear it, we know it's true, right? So the sheep know their shepherd, kind of thing. But without the shepherd actually calling in the form of the gospel in the Bible itself, or through someone telling us about it, really there would be no way to actually know it. So that's what special revelation is. It's revealed to us in a special manner. Okay, so let's start talking about these different categories of people that might not have heard about Jesus, right? So we have the people on the man on the island type situation, right? Which is just a metaphor for anyone that has been so encapsulated that they've never been exposed to the gospel in any way, shape, or form. But then we also have people that existed before Jesus, right? Which is kind of a categorically different thing, because these are people that it would have been impossible for them to be exposed to the gospel because Jesus hadn't yet come, right? So what do you think happened to people before Jesus? They did, right? So the law was kind of the Jewish understanding about how you were saved, I guess, which actually Jesus condemned, right? He condemned the Pharisees for that kind of idea, this legalism, that they could save themselves, right? So in light of that, so before Jesus, it was still the faithful that were credited righteousness without hearing of him, right? So we have Romans 4:3, which says that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. So it wasn't like, like what you were saying. I think a lot of the Jews had this misconception at the time that their works were going to save them. But it was still, when Abraham had faith to almost sacrifice Isaac, that was credited to him as righteousness because he had faith in the one true God, even though Jesus had not yet come to him, or come to earth. So we have this. So the forefathers were made righteous, we kind of just established that, not by works, but by their faith in the one true God. And Christ's sacrifice applied to the faithful followers under the old covenant retroactively. So when Christ, and Russ, if you want to expound upon this, feel free. But when he was sacrificed on the cross, that then applied to all the faithful before him. So there's this imagery that goes on where he went down into hell and set the captives free, meaning the captives that were kept in Hades. And you might know the theology on this a little better than me, but the way that it's conceptualized is that hell back before Jesus was actually divided into two different sides. There was Hades, it was considered Hades. One was true hell, right, which is where people that didn't have faith went, and then there's the other side, which is where the faithful went. It was actually called paradise. And then when Jesus, set the captives free, set the faithful that were in paradise free to heaven, right? So that's kind of what was going on there. Do you want to add on to that at all?
Just in 1 Peter 3 and in Ephesians 4, that kind of idea is represented.
Right, and there's some interpretation you have to do with that.
1 Peter 3 is pretty solid. Ephesians 4
a little
tougher to come to that conclusion. But still, the understanding in the New Testament is that God's mercy is very wide and deep. And I think that's important for us to grasp. He really is a merciful and just God. And he goes way above and beyond any of us to try and bring people into heaven.
Right, including the faithful before Jesus, right?
Including the faithful. Yeah.
Right. So, and actually you can look to Hebrews 11, right? There's the Hebrews Hall of Faith, right, where he talks about all the faithful, where the author of Hebrews is talking about all the faithful that we can expect to see in heaven, right? So that included all the patriarchs and different other personages from the Old Testament. So something to note with this, that it does not apply to followers of false gods, right? So if you were worshiping Molech, no matter how big your faith was in Molech or Zeus, that wasn't the kind of faith that would have saved you before the New Testament, or before Jesus. Okay, so what about people who live after Jesus? So this is like the true man on the island situation. So there's different approaches to this. There's the restrictivist approach, which is the belief that God does not provide salvation to those who do not come to a faith in Jesus himself before they die, right? So, and this, I think, is probably the more mainstream approach. I think this is the one that most people think of when they think of, what happens to people who don't come to faith in Jesus. It's probably the one that I feel is the most biblical. I don't know if you have, we can... Yeah. We'll go through it. But so it's probably the one that I agree with the most. I think it's the most biblically sound. Some stipulations with this. So restrictivists do not believe that there are exceptions to this, right? So we were talking about last week how like young infants, right? This would not apply to them. They're not accountable. We looked at 2 Samuel and how David was expecting to see his son in heaven, right? The one that had passed away, that he had with Bathsheba. And because of that, we have some basis for believing that infants aren't judged, or even young children that could not come to that don't have that level of accountability. Same thing with the handicapped, right? So if you have a mental condition that prevents you from really being able to make true decisions, we can't. I would say that they would fall into that category as well. They also hold the same belief that the faithful followers of God before Jesus are still, in heaven. They consider that to be categorically different than people who live after Jesus that then don't know about haven't come to saving faith. And so their basic premise is that we just have to trust that the results will be fair based on God's perfect judgment, since he is a perfectly good and just and holy God. And some ways that I try to illustrate this is God is omniscient, right? He knows everything. So, hypothetically, let's do the man on the island situation where there's someone who was literally born on an island and no one has ever been there before and they were worshiping some tribal, god or whatever. If God, in his omniscience, knows that there are people on that island that will come to saving faith, do you think he's going to send a missionary there? It would be reasonable to say that he would, through some miraculous sequence of events, he would send a missionary there, and they would come to that saving faith. It's also important to note that the gospel is pretty much everywhere at this point in time. There's no, to our knowledge, am I right on that? Like that there's...
There's been an explosion, especially in the last 60, 70 years, as to where the gospel has gone. It's penetrated in almost every indigenous people group in the world.
Right.
It's amazing.
It really is. I know with the iPhones these days. At this point, it's more of a theoretical argument that they're making, and they can try to make it from, like, say, 100 years ago, if they want to try to make that argument, what happened to those people. And in those cases, I would say, like Philip the Evangelist, right? So how, it was kind of a miracle that he just knew to go to the Ethiopian, right? So I don't know if you remember that story from Acts, but there was an Ethiopian that was traveling, and he was reading Isaiah, and he didn't understand it. And God sends Philip the Evangelist over there to help him understand it, and he does, and he comes to saving faith, and he gets baptized, and then Philip the Evangelist just kind of dematerialized, right? Doesn't he kind of just like, he was gone. And that I look at that as like one of those miracles where God knew the Ethiopian was right there. He's like fruit ripe for the picking. And he sent Philip the Evangelist there, and he was actually a very well-known evangelist. I mean, he was saving like thousands of people, right, in his day. And so for him to just go for one, like God sent him to that one Ethiopian. I think he still does that today. And he's been doing it this whole time, not just in Philip the Evangelist's day, and through medieval times, through the colonial era, like the whole time this has been going on. So let's talk about inclusivism a little bit. So inclusivists believe that those who have not heard about Jesus can be saved if they respond to God in faith based on general revelation. Okay, so what that means, based on general revelation. So if general revelation is enough to condemn us, their idea is that it should also be enough to potentially save us. So we're able to know that we're sinning, that we have this moral conscience. We know that intuitively that God exists based on his creation. And because that is enough, so we're left without excuse, right? So because we know that and we sin anyway, we're left without excuse, right? That's the idea with general revelation. So we have no way out. Their idea is that we can also be saved by that, by being faithful. So we recognize that there is this moral conscience, and we have to have this faith in this God I don't understand, and that should be enough to save them. It's kind of this reverse argument that they're making. I don't personally believe that it's biblical. I think it has more problems than it does solutions. For one, I mean, we are told that we actually have to profess that Jesus is Lord in order to get saved, which we can't do that if we're just intuitively saying it's some God, which they might think is a pagan God, right, as far as we know. What else do I say about that? Here we go. Let me just go down here a little bit. Just want to make sure I hit all of it. So it's not the same as religious pluralism. So it's not that they believe that Krishna is actually the one, or whatever the other god is the one saving the person. It's still Christ's atonement that is applying to them in their ignorance. So Jesus' sacrifice is it's just being applied to them even though they don't know it, right? They have this concept that there's God, and they want to have faith, but since they haven't really heard the word of God, it's just being applied to them in their lack of knowledge. So they're still Christians. They're not saying that other religions are true. So I just want to make that distinction. And on top of that, if someone does hear the gospel and then rejects it, then they're lost, right? So it's still it's still a Christian view. It's just a little bit interesting, a little bit of an interesting take. One of the biggest issues that I have with inclusivism is that it kind of negates the need for the Great Commission, right? Because what does the Great Commission tell us to do?
Spread the word.
Right. So we want to go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And why would we have a need to do that if they can just come to saving faith without that? I think it really just kind of nullifies that. So I don't really think it's particularly biblical, but it's good to know, just because these are different approaches that people have with answering that question. So let's just kind of keep going. So what's certain is that God will be fair, okay? So God's perfectly just, so we can be confident that he'll do what's fair on Judgment Day. A lot of Christians just prefer to remain agnostic on this question. They just say, well, it's not really in the Bible, I don't know, and there's nothing really wrong with holding that position. I think it's just good to know this stuff, though, because when people try to offer us, rational explanations as to why God might be evil, well, we want to have rational explanations as to why that might not be true, why he's actually still good. Also, I forgot to mention that. Or do I? No. So something to note from the very beginning. I don't want to go all the way back. Is it unfair for God to judge us if God wanted to judge all of us right now? We kind of talked about this last week. Is that a bad thing if He judged the whole world right now and sent us all to hell? Would that be unfair?
Because He's God.
Because He's God, right? And because why? What are we?
Sinful people.
Sinful people. We're guilty, right? So it's not unfair for God to send all of us to hell right now. And so if He chooses to send some people to hell and not others, it's no blight against God. It might seem a little bit like He's playing favorites a little bit, but grace is this above and beyond act, right? He is forgiving people that don't deserve to be forgiven. And so when He forgives some people that don't deserve to be forgiven and not others, it's just He's going above and beyond for some and not others. But if He wanted to blow us all up right now, there's really no problem with that as far as God's concerned. He's still perfectly good and just and holy if He were to do that. So really the argument from the get-go that God is not being fair is a little bit misconstrued because he's still perfectly fair if he enacts His judgment on everyone. So does that make sense, or am I okay? All right, so let's move on to the next question. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. So why would God need worship? What do you think? What do you think about that statement? Why would God need worship?
Why do we need worship? We need that practice.
So we need to worship.
Yes.
You mean it's actually for us, not necessarily for God, or is that what you're saying?
We're worshiping to God, but we need to gather together we need that for our relationship.
Right. So it helps us. It doesn't help God. It helps
Yes.
us. Right. Okay. That's that right off the bat. You got that. So I was going to say that, but now she already said it for me.
You probably could have said it a little bit.
Oh, I don't know about that. But let's just break this down a little bit. So worship, as defined by Natasha Crane, so the author of the book, is that we're responding to all that God is with all that we are. So and we're going to talk about what is all that God is. So people often think that worshiping God is comparable to worshiping humans. And so I think a lot of people, it leaves a bad taste in their mouth when they think of this God that needs our worship. Like they have this misconception that He needs our worship, and it's almost like this attention-seeking creator that just wants us to bend the knee. And it leaves a bad taste in our mouth because of I think, our idea about worship on a human level, right? So because humans have tried to do that before, right? We think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how basically they were trying to Nebuchadnezzar. That was Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to worship this giant statue, right? Which was basically him. It was a representation of him. So he wanted them all to bow down and worship that thing, and they refused, and it got them in big trouble, right? So there's been these times in history that leaders have essentially asked for worship from their subjects in some way. And it always leaves us a bad taste in our mouth. Any idea as to why that might leave a bad taste in our mouth? Why we don't like that? Oh, just you can throw ideas out there.
We're making them godlike then, that they're above us.
Right, and so the assumption is that they're not above us, right? That we are of equal value, right? Mm-hmm. Which is we're all made in God's image, right? So we all have that same stamp of God's image on us, and that is, spiritually speaking, what makes us we're all on equal level, right? So there should not be this dynamic of people worshiping people, because this is a spiritual act that's going on there. But is that going on with God, right? Does God have maybe more value than we do?
Well, He made us.
He made us, right? The way that I think of it is that God's not made in His image. God is God, right? So he's not like some reflection of Himself. He is actually the real thing. So spiritually speaking, He has immeasurable worth. And He considers us to have immeasurable worth, but there is this difference between His level of worth and our level of worth. We are not God, and that relationship is one of worship. So equals don't worship one another, but subordinates naturally worship their superiors, and God is superior to us, spiritually speaking.
Side note,
Oh, are people like just?
You know, yeah, it's like the media and what they place on celebrities and. Oh my god.
Yeah, I saw the game because that was at was it the Phillies game or not the Phillies, the Eagles. As the Chiefs. Okay, I couldn't remember which game it was. I was watching it though, and I know that she was there, but
It's just been
blowing up all over. And I think our culture does that all the time. So whether it's Taylor Swift or if we're talking about some politician or whoever it is, we do have this tendency to worship people. So and I think if you have spiritual sight, you realize that that's just not right.
It's so pathetic to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Just shake my head and everything.
This is a little before your time, but back in the 60s, John Lennon made a statement about that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus.
Oh no.
And I remember the blowback that came because of that statement, but it was,
Deservedly so.
deservedly so. And then backed away. Yeah, maybe that's the wrong thing to say.
Yeah. Did he back up on that? Did he backed off? Yeah. Yeah.
But you get to that point when the Beatles were big at that time, and that can get to you.
Oh, it sure can. I think that's very natural, especially if you yourself are not restrained by a Christian worldview, right? Because as a Christian, you know that's not right. To ask to seek worship for yourself. But if you don't have that, where does the worship naturally go? If you're not worshiping God, where does it go? It goes to you. It goes to something else. It can go to money. It can go to power. But it's not going to God. So we all worship. We all have that need to worship. It's just where is that worship being geared towards? And the only right place for that to go that fulfills us in a healthy way is to God. Right? So I think I talk about that later, but I'll have to. So yeah, I just won't mention it then. So here's the final question: is does God need our worship? I guess I answer it there. Right, so he's perfectly self-sufficient on himself. So he doesn't need to make us to be any more fulfilled. Right? He just desired. He just wanted to make us. That was like it was very good when he made humans, and he determined that it was very good. But he doesn't need it in any way. So it's actually a mischaracterization of God to say that he needs our worship. That can be said in a different ways. And actually, Acts 17:25 kind of sums that message up and says that he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Right? So God is perfectly self-sufficient in and of himself. Okay, but what about this question? Does God want our worship? What do you think? Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, is that he does. So it's not arrogant for God to want our worship. So this indicates an inflated sense of self. So that's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. When people ask for worship, I think one of the reasons why it rubs us the wrong way is because it's arrogant of them. They seem to have this inflated sense of self. Like they think they actually have more value than us, right? The question is, does God have an inflated sense of self when he says that it's good for us to worship him? Why? Any ideas?
Well, Nicole was kind of saying it. Just basically, it's more about us being and getting closer to God. It's not about God, and he knows it. Yeah.
Also, so when I feel like I'm Alex Trebek over here, who has all the answers, and it seems like I'm really smart. I actually just read the book, and it's just like that's why I know all this stuff.
You're explaining it very well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
This is good.
Good. But one of the ways that she described it is that he has an accurate sense of his immeasurable worth. So it's not actually inflated. You can't get any more inflated. Like his worth can't go any higher. So he just has an accurate understanding of how good he actually is. And so when he asks for our worship, it's not really. He's not arrogant about it. He just deserves it. And he knows that it is actually good for us. He designed us for this worship, this act of worship, this relationship of worship. So he seeks us, like Nicole was saying, he seeks our worship not for his fulfillment, but for ours. So that's what I wrote there. And worship is a natural response to an accurate understanding of who God is. And kind of the way that I put this. So. So it's. I think the inverse of that is that we can think that it's that that we have this reluctant humility of worshiping an attention-seeking creator. And what's going on there is the person either has an inflated sense of their self, right, that they're being prideful, or they're diminishing God's worth, right? So when they have this idea that God is not worthy of worship, either they're puffing themselves up or they're taking God down, and that's how they're coming to that conclusion. They're equating themselves with God in some way. So that kind of sums that up. Let's move on to this one. So responding to God with all that we are. So let's just talk about worship a little bit more. So many of us hold the misconception that worship is only the music before the sermon. So I see Katie shaking her head. So what else can be worship?
Sharing and talking about God with a friend.
Yeah, that fits. Anything else?
I would go so far as to say that worship is when we go out this afternoon for prayer walk.
Prayer walk?
If you want to worship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really worship, and this actually, one of your sermons kind of talked about this a little bit, like with the kids and how they were working and they were engaging their spiritual gifts, which is not limited to the fruits of to the gifts enumerated by Paul, right? So really, worship is just whatever we do for God, right? In a sense, and that can include a lot of things. So it's prayer, it's things that we might think it's a prayer, Bible reading, but even like you're at 15 minutes, so.
It's very, very interesting.
Okay, good. No, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'll.
Nice to see you.
Yep. So prayer, Bible, giving of resources. So like financial giving is another way is another act of worship. But really, just any time that we are in the Spirit, right? That we are encouraging someone, that we're using our spiritual gifts, hospitality, and any one of those ways are worship. So worship is more of a lifestyle as opposed to even like let alone the music, but even the sermon itself. It goes far beyond what happens in church. Yeah. I really think it is. I think it's, when you start to like take this stuff in on a regular basis, it's kind of hard for it not to just seep into everything that you do. And it really does, it makes life a lot more joyful, right? When it fills you with this purpose, right? As everything that you're doing is for Jesus, whether it's raising your kids or whether it's, getting your husband a coffee or, whatever it is that you're doing, it all is just, you're serving and it feels really good to serve. So how we worship also matters, and Jesus actually talks about this. I got to read my notes a little bit. So Jesus tells us that we should worship in spirit and truth. Any idea what that might mean? You can just throw spaghetti at the wall, but
Having Him on our hearts, but also making sure what we're speaking and thinking holds true to the Bible.
That's pretty good. I think that's pretty close. Yeah, that might be dead on actually. So kind of the way that I like to illustrate this. This wasn't in the book, but I think this probably holds water. Have you seen mob movies, like any Robert De Niro type movies? Okay, I think it was Analyze This, one of them. But they just finished a hit job of like killing someone, and for not like paying them or whatever. And then a scene or two later. They're Italian, right? So they're very heavily Catholic, and they go to mass, and they're like worshiping and doing the whole ritual thing. And I think that's a good example of maybe worshiping in spirit, but not at all in truth, like zero truth. Yeah. Like they're going out killing people, so which Jesus has strong words for that. And I would even question the spirit. Like, are they really in the spirit when they're at church? Like, can you really be in the spirit if you don't have the truth? Whereas I think the spirit kind of follows the truth in a way. But I guess you can be all truth. Like some of this, sometimes apologists can get like this, where it just becomes cold knowledge to them, and they no longer have that emotional, connection to God. So you want both, where you have this emotional, inspirited connection, but you also are holding on to truth. John Piper put it nicely. He says that true worship comes from people who are deeply emotional and who love sound doctrine. So that's just kind of how he sums that up. But yeah, I think the way that you illustrated it was pretty much accurate to what John Piper said. So
Can I say that I've had that experience with a lot of Catholic believers, that it is mostly
like no truth.
Spirit, yeah, it's mostly spirit, but no truth.
Yeah, I think unfortunately they're not encouraged to read their Bible. And so they don't really know the truth a lot of times. I've noticed that too. So it is what it is. But that's what we're doing here, right? So we are edifying ourselves. We are looking into the Bible, even if it's indirectly. I know that apologetic discussion, certainly we have biblical subjects that we're talking about. But that's what when we go to Sunday school, when we listen to Pastor Russ today, preach the word. This is what builds us up, right? That helps us to know that truth, so that we can effectively worship in the way that Jesus wanted us to. So, I kind of already talked about that, so we don't need to touch that. So a different subject now. So why is God so hidden? Any ideas on that?
I don't think he is hidden.
Okay. What do you mean?
Well, like we talked in the beginning, we can see him everywhere, and the effects of his goodness, we just have to be open to
Seeing it. Okay, cool. Now, if I were to rephrase this question, probably in a way that an atheist might mean it, why doesn't God just manifest himself to me all the time and show me like his physical presence? More just playing devil's advocate, because I totally agree with you. But in that case, why do you think he doesn't do that?
Faith?
Like he wants us to have faith? Let's just dive right into it. So I think that depending on what you mean by faith, I think that could work. So here's the general argument that they're putting forward. So if God exists, he would make himself obvious to us. Right, so that's the first premise. Second premise is that God has not made himself obvious to us. And then the final conclusion is that he must not exist. So if you were just kind of like tear that apart for a little bit, what do you think about those premises?
Well, he did make himself obvious for Jesus.
Okay, I like that. Yes. So you're saying that the premise is false because he did make himself obvious. Okay, so good. Good. So I think let's just run with that. So, I did want to mention that. So this is actually a question that Christians can struggle with too at times, right? So this isn't just like an atheist argument that like God is hidden. I think people, even Christians, when they're deeply in prayer and they really want something but they're not getting it, they can feel like, well, why isn't God just revealing himself to me? Or if say we're just asking for guidance from the Holy Spirit and we just don't seem to be getting an answer, it can seem like God's not there sometimes. So this is an issue that both Christians and atheists struggle with, just in different ways. So let's talk about that first premise a little bit. So if God exists, he would make himself more obvious. So you're saying that he did. You guys are saying that he did make himself obvious to us, which I think is good. So so let's just kind of break down the assumption that's going on here to begin with. So we are in no position to know anything about how God would act, right? So that's the first idea. So let's say that God made himself completely unobvious to us. He didn't interact with the world at all. Does that mean God doesn't exist? No. In fact, there's a whole line of philosophy called deism that has that exact idea, right? Which is that God created the whole world. You think of it like creating like a marble contraption. He set it all up, put the marble at the top, let it go down, and then walked out the door and never interacted with it ever again. And there are people that believe that. And so there's a way to believe in God. I think it's unbiblical. That deism is not a biblical belief, but there's a way to believe in God where he's not interacting with the world at all. So the assumption itself is kind of flawed right from the get-go. So let's move on to the next part. But it's more difficult to answer in a Christian context where we actually have biblical grounds that God should be interacting with us, or at least we think he should be interacting with us. And he's making specific demands on his people while he is hidden, right? So Jesus tells us to come to the knowledge of the truth and to be saved by believing in him, right? And some people will say, well, that'd be a lot easier if Jesus just told me, right? So that's something that you'll hear from non-believers sometimes, or unbelievers. But now, can you think of any reasons why God would actually want to remain hidden, maybe, instead of making himself very obvious to us by manifesting himself? If you don't, it's okay. So it actually ties back to what we were talking about last week, this whole idea of freedom, right? So if God were to display his great, powerful, because he's omnipotent, right? He is more powerful than anything we can possibly imagine. You can imagine that would be kind of frightening. And it might actually coerce us into loving him. We would no longer have that freedom to seek or avoid him, for him to really know that we actually love him, right? So he gives us this, he kind of maintains this hiddenness so that we have the freedom to choose or not. And kind of the way that I like to illustrate this is, if you want to test your kid's obedience, what do? If you give your kid a rule and you want to see if he's going to follow it or she's going to follow it, what do?
Make them think you're not watching.
Right. You hide yourself, right? So that's essentially what, God is doing with us. He's seeing, well, I want to know if these people actually can love me or will love me in my absence. I'm going to tell them, I'm going to give them Jesus. I'm going to show them that I am real, but are they going to actually follow me in my absence? And so I think that's kind of a pretty powerful argument for why God wouldn't make himself as obvious to us, even though he has presented himself. We have evidence, right, like you were saying. But the reason why he might not be presenting himself all the time forever and ever and ever is because he wants to test our obedience.
Ellie did that last night.
What's that?
Ellie at like 8 o'clock asked if she could have a snack.
Uh-huh.
Jonathan said no. She went over to the pantry. We knew she went to the pantry. She came back with nothing but this little bump under her belly. We're like, yeah, no.
Yep. She failed the obedience test. Darn. Oh, man. Sinful from day one, right? That's funny. Let's see. Was there anything I wanted to cover from that? Nope. I think I got everything I wanted to talk about. Okay. So God has not made himself obvious to us. So this is what Nicole was kind of saying before, right? So that he actually has made himself obvious to us, right? So there's two different ways to interpret this premise. And the first way is that God has not made himself so obvious that it's undeniable. That's what we were just talking about a second ago, right? That God isn't like physically manifest next to me. And there's any number of reasons why he might do that. The primary one being that he wants to give us the chance to actually genuinely seek or avoid him without coercion, okay? But he could do that for any number of reasons. I mean, if he wants to, he could just walk out the door and leave. I mean, who knows why God doesn't make himself that obvious. I'm just trying to propose alternatives or explanations for that. So, 2. God has not revealed himself to us in any meaningful way. And I think this is what Nicole was really hitting on, is that we think that the design of the universe is meaningful, right? That actually shows something, that DNA, having specified complexity, is meaningful. The cosmological argument, right, is meaningful, that the universe has a cause. And is it more reasonable to say that it came from an intelligent being or an inert piece of matter? Right? Because that's what it comes down to. And so there's evidences that God has given us, this little trail that he's given us to come to the conclusion that he is real and that he does exist. It's just, do you consider it meaningful? And is it enough evidence, right? And that's really what it comes down to. And so the little subtext there is that the question isn't whether God has revealed himself in a way that we deem sufficient. It's whether he deems it sufficient, right? He's the one that's going to call the shots, right? We can't say that wasn't enough. Because if God did reveal himself in a way that he deems sufficient, then it would behoove us to recognize that, right? So, anything I'm missing that I didn't hit upon? Nope. We talked about that. Let's see if there's anything. Okay, so for some, no amount of evidence short of a personal visit from God will be enough. But of course, if that's not how God decided to reveal himself, I mean, what are you supposed to do? I mean, you want to be seeking the truth. You don't want the truth to find you. That's because sometimes it won't. So is faith the opposite of reason? So we're kind of shifting gears again. I've got Gil Grisham. I don't know if any of you watch CSI, but he's all about reason. So, he's nothing but the facts, man, type of person. And so the first thing that we do is we define reason, right? So it's the act of engaging the mind, which is something that everyone does. And so, right from the outset, can reason be the opposite of faith if reason is something that everyone does? Does no one have faith? Some people do, I would say, right? Right. So if in order for faith to really be something that is the opposite of reason, it has to be something that no one does, since everyone engages the mind. Now, of course, there is a continuation of that definition where you have ideal circumstances for reason, right? Which is that you're using logic, right? That you're using careful thinking, that you're drawing upon evidence and all those kinds of things in your reasoning, right? So a lot of times, I think what really the accusation that atheists are making against Christians is not that they don't reason, it's that they reason poorly, that they're not using their critical thinking, that they're not drawing upon evidence, and so on, right? And Richard Dawkins is known for this quote, so faith is belief in spite of the lack of evidence, right? So really what he's saying there is that we're believing in something because we don't have evidence, right? Is that the case, though? Is that what all some Christians might be doing that, right? They're just like, I don't have any evidence, so I'm just going to completely rely on my faith and deny all the evidence that scientists or whoever is putting in front of me. Is that what all Christians are doing, though? Is that a good way to come to faith, actually? No, right? You actually want to. So it's a false. I would actually argue that both Christians and atheists do this, where they rely solely on their faith in a certain authoritative source, right? Whether it's the Bible or whether it's science, okay? I think that atheists do this oftentimes. They don't actually look at the evidence for evolution. They just know that the scientists are saying that evolution is true, and therefore they have faith in the scientists and say that Christianity can't be true because of their faith in science. They wouldn't use the word faith. They would just say they believe in science, but what is belief? There's actually some really good. Have either of you seen The Case for Christ?
Yes.
Have you?
I have. I've heard of it, but I don't think I've seen it.
You should see it. It's a powerful movie because it talks about a guy who his wife became a Christian, right, through a certain sequence of events. Their daughter ended up choking on something, and they were at a restaurant, and it was a Christian nurse that did the Heimlich.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And because of that, she developed the mom developed a relationship with this nurse, became a Christian herself, and this caused a lot of problems for her husband, who then was on a mission to prove her wrong. He was a journalist. He was all about the facts, and he just considered Christianity to be a big hoax. And he was a pretty well-known journalist too. He worked for the Chicago Tribune, and he went all around the United States talking to medical doctors, talking to philosophers, talking to certain different well-known pastors at the time, archaeologists, like all these different people to try to invalidate the Christian faith. He came to faith through that process, right? So this extreme use of his rational thinking got him to faith. So it's when atheists make this claim that faith is the opposite of reason, actually, reason can be the vehicle for faith at times, right? It all depends on how you're using it. So, but it's a great story. I would write that down if you haven't seen it. The Case for Christ is a great movie. It's actually well produced too. It's not like one of those Christian movies that has cheesy B acting and all that. It's a good movie. So let's define faith a little bit. All right, I'm actually somewhat on time. We're a little bit after 9, but it won't take me long to run through these. So Hebrews 11:1. So faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. What do you think atheists might latch onto with this definition of faith? If they're trying to say, discredit this, what do you think they're going to say?
The assurance of things hoped for?
Specifically, what word?
Hope,
right? They're going to look at hope, and what are they going to think? How would they define that?
It's not concrete.
Not concrete, like wishful thinking,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So, but let me what does assurance mean when you have assurance of something?
That's true.
It's true, you're kind of certain about it, right? You have this, that it's this true thing that you're certain of. So let me just rephrase this and tell me if it makes sense. Faith is the certainty of things wished for, the conviction of things not seen. Does that statement make sense?
Not really.
No.
Can you be certain about anything you're wishing for?
No.
No, right. So let's talk about when this was written. So Hebrews 11. So Hebrews was written again. So since it's apostolic, so this is going on in the first. Well, I gave it out. So this is the 1st century AD, right? So we're going back to the times of the apostles. Now we don't know exactly who wrote Hebrews, but it is someone who's a contemporary of Paul and all the other apostles. So these are people within striking distance of Jesus' life, right? And why did the apostles have this unshakable faith? Why were they willing to die for the things that they believed?
Because they walked with him.
They saw it.
As a person.
Yeah, they saw his miracles. They saw his fulfillment of prophecy. They knew his wisdom. They saw his resurrection. They saw the death, like all of that stuff that was revealed to them. And so they had no doubts, right? There was no doubt that if Jesus said something, it was true. And so when we think about whoever wrote Hebrews, the reason why they had certainty is because they knew Jesus, right? And when they're saying hoped for, they're not hoping for it in terms of wishful thinking. They're just waiting for it. They just know it's going to happen. So they're looking forward to it. So the better way of really saying that faith is the certainty of things that we look forward to, the conviction of things not seen. Now, they're not seen because they haven't happened yet. Like Jesus, the second coming hasn't happened yet. They're not in heaven yet. And so that's when it says not seen, it's talking about what they're waiting for, and that isn't actually happening at that particular moment. So it's not belief, but it's commitment to a belief when there's good evidence for it. And everyone exercises this all the time. So when I talk about, all right, so when we're getting on a flight to go somewhere, okay, do we customarily, ask the pilot to see his license and check the cargo to see if there's explosives in the cargo? Is that something that we commonly do? Why not?
We just hope there's not.
We hope, right? Is there maybe some good evidence that there's not explosives?
Well, we're also putting faith in the system of
Right.
all the
Checks
security
and
that
balances.
has been put in place.
Right. So yes, we are. We do have faith that the airlines are, crossing their T's, dotting their I's, making sure that they're following regulation. And I think the evidence for that is that planes don't crash every other day, right? So we know that generally flights are a safe way to travel, and that's the evidence. So so it's not belief, but commitment to a belief when there's good evidence for it. It's something that everyone does. So faith is not something that atheists don't do. They do it all the time. They do it thousands of times a day. When I sit down on this chair, I have the faith that it's not going to collapse on me. We're constantly exercising faith. And the ultimate testimony that God values evidence is Jesus' life itself, right? God didn't just send Jesus here and Jesus just told people, by the way, I'm the Son of God, and then he died on the cross and resurrected. Actually, wouldn't even resurrect him, he would have just died on the cross, and that would have been it, right? That would have been a presentation of Christ without any evidence at all. And of course, God didn't do that, right? God, he gave us all those miracles. He showed his fulfillment of prophecy. He did resurrect himself from the dead as evidence that he was who he said he was. Of course, God didn't have to do it that way. He could have literally just, asked people to blindly believe that he was God and without any evidence at all, and the ones that just happened to believe him based on blind faith would have been the ones that were saved. Of course, that would have been a very, very, very minuscule amount of people because people don't operate that way. And so really the ultimate testimony that God does value evidence is Jesus' life itself through the many evidences that he gave when he was here, right? So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for today's presentation. Any questions? Oh, good. So I'm almost done. Oh, you're very welcome. And then I don't know if I've been making these all that obvious, but there's actually some verses that talk about apologetics a little bit. So we are therefore Christ's ambassadors as though God were making his appeal through us. So we want to be able to know some of this stuff so that we can be effective representatives of him here. When people ask us these questions of, why do you believe what you believe? We want to be able to effectively answer that, especially if they have kind of tough questions for us, because some of these questions aren't that easy to answer without some level of knowledge. So, and then the bottom one just kind of reaffirms that. So we want to be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that is in us, right? And this doesn't apply to trolls. Okay, so people that are just looking for a fight. So if someone's just looking to get in a fight with you, you can dismiss that person. You don't have to engage. But if someone genuinely wants to know, your faith just seems kind of crazy to me. There's people rising from the dead and all this stuff. Why do you believe that? And it's in good faith. We want to be able to answer them, right? So in a kind and respectful way. So, yeah, that's it. You're welcome.